Oh, Jana, I don't see that we are.
Yep.
Okay.
We are now.
Okay, good. Because I didn't see the little recording going on. Awesome. Well, welcome, all of you good people. Thank you so much for being here to think again. And I'm super, oh, now Bill disappeared. We got just his name. Super excited to talk to Will tonight. I met Will thanks via Ross Collier, who's on right now. Longtime friend and conversation partner Ross is. And Ross invited me to go to a meeting, the First Amendment Society, which is kind of, how would you describe that, Ross? A funding arm or just an adjacent support group to the Tribune?
I don't know, maybe Will can describe it better, actually. I've been to a couple of meetings, both Zoom and I think the only live one I did is, or in-person one I did was the one with you, Jay.
Okay.
It's, I don't know, something of a promo to get people to donate and kind of thing. Will?
So the short version is, and we're trying to figure out the right story, but we are, at this point coming up on what, we're 4 days away from being exactly 22 months after having received IRS approval to be the first legacy newsroom to make the transition to becoming a nonprofit. And so for us, a part of that is, and we'll go into more of this in much nerdier ways as the conversation goes on, but having to kind of build a fundraising apparatus from the ground up. But part of that is also, how do we try and build ways to just be in relationship with the people who believe in democracy and news and in investing in nonprofits of all kinds, whether it's us or all of the other things that folks like those of you who are on and listening donate to here in Utah. And it coincided with the fact that April 15th of 2021 was the 150th anniversary of the first issue published by the Tribune. And so essentially we are looking at, how do we create essentially a founder's circle, right? Who are the people who are going to help us kick off this next phase of our journey as we try and prove something big and scary and hopeful for news and for Utah around what we might be able to do if we don't have to worry about getting sold next week or the next round of layoffs, and can really start building for the long term and getting more ambitious, both in terms of the scope of what we want to be as an organization, but much more importantly in the scope of our journalism. And so the First Amendment Society was kind of the first piece of that, which was a kind of renewable membership society for folks who are pledging 3 years of gifts, which helps us build out, it's literally the first dollars we have ever had projected more than a year out in 100 and now almost 51 years, right? And it's an organization that has so deep in its bones, just living and breathing the daily news cycle and trying to think any further out than, the 30 hours after which we might start thinking about tomorrow's paper, much less trying to figure out how do we think, week to week, but certainly a year, multiple years, it's a sense of freedom that, some of my colleagues who have been there for decades have never had before. And it's exciting and it's daunting. And so to Ross and others, big thank you. But we're still trying to invent what it is. And so part of the fun of this moment and kind of everything being up in the air, but in a really positive way, is that there's a big opportunity for folks to come in and help us figure out, what should that look like? What would be most exciting? What would be most important? What do you want to help us accomplish? And that's part of it.
I love that. So Will, tell me, this was asked by my son who was over for dinner last night when I was describing this conversation. He has a big distrust of media in general. He's one of those people. And he has a little more trust of local media, but even then he feels like they just kind of parrot the big monoliths with all the money. So his question to me was, so how will being a nonprofit maybe make the Tribune a more reliable source of news, I guess?
Yeah. So I would say there are three big things that have happened since November 2019 that are all related to that transition. And as we've been having a lot more conversations, frankly, like these with readers and subscribers and supporters and non-readers, maybe most importantly, non-readers, people are using words like, it feels like the Tribune is back, or the journalism is as good as it once was. We know that there was a dip, but it feels like hopefully we're on the upswing. And so I would say the reason that the nonprofit piece matters is threefold. So first of all, I have dozens of friends in newsrooms all across the country. And, we're looking at well over, 200 or 300 newsrooms that have shuttered completely since COVID. 1,500 news organizations have closed since 2004. And not a small part of that has been for the exact kind of corporate underpinnings that it sounds like are behind your son's question, which is, this is, as a for-profit business, what does that really mean, right? And so I think across most news organizations, you've seen people fight really hard and I think maintain editorial independence. But what it comes at the cost of is, are you going to be sold tomorrow? And if you are sold tomorrow, are they going to demand change at the top and try and put in people who are going to listen more and try and push those boundaries more? And are there going to be layoffs, right? And what we're seeing with the Chicago Tribune right now is it can be a really lucrative business to sell a newspaper for parts. And it essentially happened to the Tribune in 2013 when we were owned briefly, well, not necessarily briefly, but when we were owned by Alden Capital Group. And, the trajectory essentially was, you're never quite sure what's happening tomorrow. And people are therefore being very, I would say, conservative in their careers, but not in their journalism, right? So part of the reason journalists are all over Twitter is because you may need a job tomorrow, and the more people who know you are the more people who are going to be able to hire you, right? And so when we've gone through any number of owners over the years, and after Alden Global Capital had bought the Tribune, ultimately Paul Huntsman bought the paper from them, and then Paul was publisher and owner for a while, and then as he was one of the folks shepherding the transition to the nonprofit model, we are now owned by the community, right? As a nonprofit, there is no longer an owner. We cannot be sold again. We do not have a publisher. We have a board of directors, as any nonprofit does, for both strategic and fiscal governance. And Paul sits on the board, but has, the same amount of sway as other board members, and is, certainly more deeply connected to the history. But it means that for the first time in their careers, our journalists can go to bed and not worry that tomorrow the rug's going to get pulled out from under them. The day that I met Jay and Ross in person, we threw a party that evening to celebrate the 150th, and it was the first time that we'd invited the staff back since we went remote because of COVID. And that evening, I had a longtime journalist, somebody I actually grew up reading here in Salt Lake City, take me aside and, not teary, but borderline, like Pixar misty, say, thank you, because I don't remember the last time we got everybody in a room and it was good news, right? Every staff meeting had been because there was layoffs, because there were sales, and that, it does a number on you in terms of confidence. It does a number on you in terms of just trauma, and this is all before COVID, but it also does a number on you in terms of how long into the future you're thinking about a story, right? And so this, I would say, is my biggest answer to the question, and the most immediate impact that I've already seen, and I joined the Trib at the end of April, is that you have people thinking about 2 and 3 and 5 year investigations because they trust that the Tribune will be around and they trust that they will be here to see it through, right? And so we're no longer just trying to write the stories that mean that when layoffs happen next week, someone gets cut instead of me. We're writing the stories that can happen because they need to be told. And that alone is reason enough to pull the trigger, right? Number two, in 1953, the Tribune and the Deseret News received very odd approval from the Department of Justice to open a joint operating agreement and launch a third company that was jointly owned, that owned the printing press and handled all print, subscriptions, distribution, sales, advertising, and marketing for both papers, with a 50-50 split of revenue. There's efficiencies in doing that in a market like Utah. Looking back, as somebody who always thought it was interesting that the Tribune published in the morning and the Deseret News was an afternoon paper, I can't wait to finally find the right person to ask, like, was that just because you were sharing a printing press? And it might have been, right? And so all of these pieces click into place, and that joint operating agreement had terms on it, and it would be up for renewal at various points. The Deseret News has had one owner since its inception. It will have one owner until the end of time. That has not been the case with the Tribune, right? So you've got different folks with different interests sitting across the table renegotiating that JOA whenever it comes up. It came up for renegotiation while Alden Global Capital owned the Tribune. And as part of that renewal, they essentially agreed to a cash transfusion where the Deseret News paid a cash buyout then in exchange for future profits from the Salt Lake Tribune. So since 2013, we've been in a 30/70 revenue sharing agreement. So, you know, for those of you who might be theater majors like me, I'm going to do the math for you. It means that somehow the Tribune has managed to not go out of business for almost a decade, getting only 60% of its own revenue, which is a miracle. That joint operating agreement was then up for expiration and potential renewal at the end of 2020. So we had this weird 11 months where November 2019, we received approval from the IRS and officially became a nonprofit. We had a strange year where all revenue was happening out of house and we were still losing money, but we were able to fundraise for the first time. So our 990s for 2020 are going to be, you know, a wonky little wonderland. But it also meant that by January 1st, we had to build an in-house advertising team for the first time since 1953. So this year we've been launching not only nonprofit fundraising, but launching paid advertising and marketing for the first time. Hired Chris Stegman from the Houston Chronicle, who has put together a 14-person team, and they are killing it. And you know, the third piece of the equation was, you know, print is a pretty lucrative business, and ad sales, you know, circulation is not where it was. Ad sales are still a thing. But when that JOA expired, there was a joint decision from the Tribune and the Deseret News to just wholesale divest and sell the printing presses and kind of dissolve the print operation, which is why you saw both papers simultaneously go from 7-day-a-week printing to only a weekly edition. And I have to admit, I was only watching one side of this transaction. I felt like you could see the writing on the wall from a mile away that the Tribune was going to go digital only. I was a little bit surprised that they kept a weekend edition. I was not on staff yet. I have, you know, no insight into those conversations. It never occurred to me that the Deseret News would also do the same, right? I think there are two reasons why this has happened. One, you just lost a lot of money. Printing a newspaper and having a print paper is actually not the place where you lose money. It is owning and running a print operation. So for us, you take those three things, become a nonprofit, and don't have to worry about somebody siphoning off profit. So every dollar above the line we make goes right back into the business, and in our case, goes into hiring. Number two, we get out of a JOA where suddenly we have 100% of our own revenue and things are looking pretty good. And number three, you take the known cause of all of your fiscal losses, which isn't actually the business model, it's running a business you're not in, which is being a printing press. And all of a sudden, you know, we hit being profitable, not that we are profitable, but you know, we're still looking for the right term. If somebody has that for me late on a Monday night, please let me know. We ended up sustainably in the black faster than we anticipated. And we are confident that we are there to stay. And the biggest reason for that, though, is because we really didn't know how our 7-day-a-week print subscribers were going to follow us on this journey, and had any number of fiscal projections of if we can hold on to this many of them, if we can get that many to activate their digital subscriptions, how can we do it? And the short version is our supporters and our readers surprised us, and we beat our most optimistic projection that anybody was willing to put in writing, right? And so when you're looking at being a community-owned nonprofit, that's a pretty good signal that there's a community here that's going to have our back. Now we've got to go figure out how to be that company and live into what they hope we can become. But the basic premise, which is the money didn't go away from subscriptions, and all the other things tipped in our favor, and we made a really good hire in Chris, who's built a really killer team. You know, in a year when we're still seeing layoffs coming down, and you know, even the Deseret News let go, I believe, 16 journalists in January when the JOA expired. We've grown by 28 people, half of which have been newsroom hires. So, you know, it's wild to be in one of the few news organizations I know that is on kind of a constant hiring spree. When we were looking at my start date, Lauren was like, actually, I need you to hold off another 2 weeks, because if I throw any more new staff at people, they're going to start just losing track of who's who, right? And I think we've got, you know, 8 or 10 other open roles on the horizon. So I'm feeling really good. I think the leadership team is feeling really good. And I think it's going to take more work for us to get the newsroom there, because they're just in it, right? We had layoffs in 2018, so people were already stretched then going into COVID, you know, and nothing tells the COVID story of the Salt Lake Tribune like the fact that our, you know, public health coverage was led by Sean Means and Andy Larson, both of whom are doing, frankly, the best work of their careers and rediscovering, you know, what they're able to do in terms of serving the community through journalism. But people are tired. And getting people to trust being hopeful is going to be a long road. And thankfully, that particular piece of it happens to be my exact job. And that's a, you know, fun as heck thing to get up in the morning for. So it was a very long answer to your son's question.
No, I love it. It's comprehensive.
Yeah,
Ross.
Yeah, hi. So use the term community owned. How does that change serving the community, if it changes it at all, from being privately owned?
Yep. It means we're having that conversation. And I don't know if anybody ever would have made the time to stop and ask that question before. And we are going through a process as an organization around, you know, mission, vision, values, some of which we're really confident in, and the board has been, you know, deeply thoughtful about before I joined. But, you know, I think we're really aware of our own shortcomings. It's a group of smart people, which means you're introspective, whether you like it or not. And we can't claim to be a news organization that can cover the things that matter most right now, which include health disparities and income inequality and, you know, wild social divisiveness and racial justice and Utah's explosive growth and all of those things if we are only a newspaper that is staffed by and writing for white people on the East Bench of the Salt Lake Valley, right? And so there's a real need for us to figure out what that looks like and how do we start doing, you know, the phrase that Lauren uses a lot of is how do we start reporting with and from communities instead of about, right? And, you know, so far, a significant percentage of the hires that we've made have been underrepresented and marginalized individuals in any number of ways. We have just about 50-50 gender parity in terms of the newsroom, including newsroom leadership, which is extraordinarily rare for the news industry itself. Lauren is an extremely humble person, and she tends to skip the gender piece because she takes for granted that she's a woman running the place. And in Utah and in news, that is not something that we should let her gloss over. It's a big deal, and she's doing an amazing job. But this year alone, we've gone from 9% people of color to 22.3, which is exactly Utah's diversity statistics. We, you know, don't necessarily match line by line, and we don't intend to stop there. But it's been a big priority for us. And I think the other thing that you can see in the hires we've made, both in terms of the journalists themselves, but also in terms of the roles that we've chosen to prioritize, is we're really reckoning with Salt Lake isn't Utah. And Utah has a need for good journalism everywhere. And there is interest, and there is necessity, and there is knowledge. But we are not trusted everywhere, right? We're that Salt Lake paper. And 20 years ago, Salt Lake wasn't itself as divisive as it is now, but it is proxy for all of the other things. And, you know, for all the right reasons, for a long time, Utah's independent voice was probably the exact right tagline. And in hindsight, as someone who's fascinated by narrative framing and narrative strategy, it just makes my skin crawl in 9 different ways, right? It's an accusation that anybody who doesn't read us isn't independent. And it's a very us versus them. And that's not who we want to be, you know, and that may be the role that the paper played back in the day, but it's not who we need to be for the future, right? So a big part of what we're focused on, and what I'm focused on, and what frankly I would welcome all of your help and ideas on, is how do we earn trust, and how do we show up in more parts of the state in ways that surprise people, in ways that are authentic. And I think that, you know, for me, I think there is a role that no other news organization on earth can play as well, in terms of accountability reporting on the LDS Church as a global institution, right? And unfortunately, what I think we've seen over time is as the newsroom got smaller and smaller, that was kind of the only piece left of what we've done on faith and on what we've done when it comes to the LDS community here in Utah. And I can't build a strategy to cover what being queer in the 21st century looks like if we're not trying to also write, you know, with and from the perspective of LGBTQ, you know, Mormons and former Mormons, and Presbyterians and Jews and, you know, atheists and whoever. I can't build a strategy to do good rural coverage if we don't acknowledge that means we're writing for a predominantly Mormon population outside of Salt Lake City, and how do we do that well, right? And so these are not simple questions, but I think they're ones that are at the very top of the list of, I would even say, the imperatives that we know we have to tackle. And I don't want to speak for the conversations that happened with other leadership and under other business structures, but they are inevitable every time we start talking strategy because of a nonprofit mission. And I don't know whether they would have come up at all before.
Okay, now, if I'm following you, part of what you're trying to do is to reach, for lack of a better term, that right wing who doesn't trust mainstream media, for lack of a better term, including the Salt Lake Tribune. And you're looking for ways to do that, but not really sure about how to do that yet?
So, yes and no, right? So I don't think it's realistic that we are ever going to be a go-to daily read for right-wing Utahns of any kind, right? But I think that we have kept our readership and our impact inadvertently artificially small. And there are, you know, when you look at the data, there's only a relatively small number of people who are interested in journalism. And of that, though, local news is always the number one thing. And so there's a little bit of growth to be had for people who are looking for trustworthy news. Can we do a better job of being a home where you might land instead of being an automatic no? I think the more exciting questions are, how do we begin to reach people in ways where the value proposition of what we're bringing to the table isn't predicated on trying to convince you to care about news? You need information to live your life, and you need that information to be accurate and trustworthy in any number of ways. And whether that is health, whether that is just